Frank Borges said I was in the goal farthest away from the locker room, and he said all these people were running on the field towards me. And he said, I was scared to death. I didn't know what they were going to do, but they picked him up on his shoulders and carried him all the way to the locker room.
Welcome to a brand new edition of the City Voice podcast. I am joined by an extremely special guest on an extremely special anniversary. This episode's called From the Hill to Brazil. They've labeled it St. Louis and the greatest upset in World Cup history. Quite bold. I'm joined by Dave Lange. Dave, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Great, thank you. And thanks for having me on, Pete. I really appreciate it.
I've heard a lot about you from day one. I've been here three or 4 years now. So it's great to finally get you on the podcast. Can you give anyone who doesn't know you a little bit of a bio about who you are and what you do? I've
been born and raised in St. Louis. I've been covering soccer for various media since the early 1970s. So I grew up with the sport here. Didn't play it very much. But I covered it for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. I coached at Bush St. Louis Soccer Club, which is now St. Louis Scott Gallagher. And then I wrote the history of the sport in St. Louis called Soccer Made in St. Louis, which came out in 2011 from Reedy Press, and the second edition came out in 2022 to bring it up to date with St. Louis City. Both of those books have sold out, so.
Kind of the opus of St. Louis soccer. It's a fantastic book. Would you class yourself as a historian of the game now? Is that how it?
I think so, for lack of a better word, yeah. People have called me other things, but I think historian is a good one.
Fantastic. Well, we're here to talk about a very specific part of St. Louis history. As an Englishman, I escaped England to come to America, so I didn't have to talk about my nation's disappointments in World Cups. But here I am talking about a game that happened 75 years ago in Brazil. But before we get into that game and some of the interesting details, I'd love to set the stage. We've done, soccer capital of America stuff in the past. But I want to talk about soccer in the USA. There's kind of a bit of a perception that it's a new sport because it's not quite at the top with some of the other games. But America does have a long, rich history of soccer. Could you tell us, leading up to the World Cup, what were the wins and what was the history? How did it start in America?
Well, the story of soccer in USA is a lot like in other countries, brought here by the British, the Irish, the Scottish when they emigrated here, or when ships stopped here. The sailors came off the ships and played soccer, and people saw it and jumped in. So it started here like it did in other countries. St. Louis being a major port of entry in the United States as a river city up the river from New Orleans and as a stopping point coming from the East Coast and from Canadian people coming south, attracted a lot of immigrants, and they brought the sport with them. So it's similar to the stories in other countries and in St. Louis as a city that it was brought in by immigrants from the United Kingdom, specifically Irish and Scottish at the very beginning.
So did it take off in St. Louis more than other places? What were the other sort of cultural hotspots for soccer in the early days?
In St. Louis, it started mainly in an Irish neighborhood called the Kerry Patch, which is just north of City Park. It no longer exists, obviously, but that's where it sort of spread from there. There was another Irish neighborhood in South St. Louis, a Spanish neighborhood by Cronlet Park. They were soccer players. The unique thing about St. Louis was the players who came over taught it to their kids, and their kids taught it to their kids, and so on and so forth. The perception that soccer started here in 1950, well, the first game here was in 1872. So the 5 guys from St. Louis who played in 1950 are third and or fourth generation soccer players.
That's incredible. Were there any notable World Cup moments before 1950? Or was that America's first dalliance in a World Cup?
They were in the very first one in 1930, made it to the semifinals where they lost. There's a St. Louis thread there, as there is in many stories of U.S. soccer. There was a guy on the team named Ralph Tracy from St. Louis. He was a starter. He was hurt in the first half, had to leave the game. As you know, in those days, there were no substitutions, so the United States had to play a man short the entire second half, and they got murdered. Bert Patnaugh did score a hat trick in the 1930 World Cup, player from the East Coast. So U.S. soccer certainly had its moments before 1950.
That's that's good to know, and I think that kind of goes against the grain. America has been trying soccer for a very long time.
Yes, and again, the St. Louis thread that runs in it. There was a guy from St. Louis named Tom Cahill who moved back to New York, where he was from. He lived here for about 35 years. He was a big picture guy. He's the guy who's credited with starting the United States Soccer Federation in 1913. He had started the first national team in 1916, took him on tours of Europe. His very big idea was to make soccer a major league sport in the United States. So he started the American Soccer League on the East Coast. And it was very big for a number of years in the 1920s. Because at that time, we only had baseball as a professional team sport that was extremely popular. College football was popular, but there was no hockey to speak of outside of the Northeast. NBA hadn't started yet, so there was a big void in that sports calendar, and he tried to fill that with soccer. What happened was, as the 20s wore on, there was some dissension. Teams tried to start their own competitions. By the time they finally solved the issues, the soccer war, it's called in soccer history in the United States.
Yeah,
the Depression hit, and that took the air out of the balloon.
It's just such a shame. And just a note, we have been working with US Soccer on this campaign. US Soccer have got a new podcast. It's called the US Soccer Podcast. So to be good partners with them, make sure that after this you tune into their podcast. Okay, let's move on to the neighborhood that changed soccer history. Take us inside the hill in the 40s that were leading up to the Cup. This Italian-American neighborhood seemed to be good at producing sporting greats. What was special about it?
What started, they were attracted by, there were clay mines nearby, very high quality clay to make bricks. Italian immigrants worked there. They brought their families over because they needed more workers. As they came here, the sport had already established itself in St. Louis. St. Louis is interesting in that in the 1880s, they started a soccer league in 1884, which is 3 years before the Football League in England.
Wow. Which
is interesting. And the first international game in U.S. history was played here in 1884. So the Italians picked up the sport because it was part of part of St. Louis fabric, developed by these generation after generation of players. Catholic Church introduced it into their parishes in the city. A great network of youth soccer started. We had a professional league in 1907. 1912, we had a very organized amateur league called the Muni League. So we had all this soccer infrastructure here. So if you wanted to play soccer, it was easy to fit in. The thing about the Hill was there was a guy named Joe Cassino who was the recreation director at the Southside YMCA. He came to the Hill in 1925 with the idea of helping these immigrants assimilate into American society. He thought, what a great way to do it if we could organize the kids. He would organize them by street. Each street had a name. Gino Periani lived on Daggett. He was a hawk. Frank Borghi was a raven. And they would meet these street groups inside, talk. Then they organized sports teams and play, baseball and soccer. So it was, the Hill was a unique neighborhood in the fact that they had this person who came in and consciously organized kids to play and to work together and learn more about America and become Americans.
So they used soccer as an assimilation tool for immigrants.
Exactly.
It's kind of beautiful. I mean, we think about soccer even today in Energizer Park. Everybody always says it brings people together. You meet people that you've never connected with before, and you have that common thread of soccer, the love of the game.
Yes, and the Hill was like other neighborhoods in St. Louis. It was very insular. In those days, nobody had a car. If you had a park, a church, a school, and some taverns, why would you go anywhere else? So the Hill was like that in a way. Guys who I had talked to said all the games were played at Sublet Park, which is on the east side of the Hill. They would show up on Saturdays. Everybody would be there. One guy told me we'd play 24 aside, and you learned how to play in a tight space. He said guys who played there could dribble in a closet. So that's where Frank Borghi, Gino Periani, Charlie Colombo, all these guys learned the game, as did other kids in St. Louis. They learned on the playground.
It's a coaching strategy, the modern era, where they shrink the pitch and teach you how to play in tight quarters. That's really interesting. So let's talk about the 5 players, the St. Louis contingent. Frank Borghi, to start with. the goalkeeper. Like, let's give me a little bit of background on these players, because it is extraordinary that 5 players would come from the same city, 4 from the same block is wild at that standard, at that level, to be able to compete. Talk me through the players.
Well, there's a backstory to that. There was a guy named Walter Giesler from St. Louis, who's the president of the U.S. Soccer Federation. He accompanied the Olympic team in 1948. They were killed in their only game. They lost 9-0 to Italy. He vowed, he said, we'll never do this again. We'll put a team together well before the next competition. We'll try to organize things, get them to play together before they go over there. So he was responsible for putting this team together. Simpkins Ford from St. Louis won the 1948 and 1950 U.S. Open Cups. This was the team of the Italian guys from the Hill. If you have your national championship team, obviously you're going to take players from there. So they took 5 players from there. Bob Annis is the guy who did not play, but he was the 5th guy from that team. So that's kind of the backstory to how that was created. Talking about them individually, we're 5 years after World War II. So you have guys who are war veterans. Frank Borghi was a medic in the 9th Infantry Division. He was in Battle of the Bulge. He was in the landings at D-Day. And as a medic, he was constantly exposing himself to fire. So he was right there in the middle of the action. There's a verified story that in 1945, when the U.S. captured the ridge at Remagen across the Rhine River, he treated one of the wounded soldiers. It turned out to be Jack Buck, the broadcaster, who later on was Cardinals.
Wow.
Play-by-play announcer.
Yeah.
And he later on at a dinner, he said, "Don't I know you?" And they talked, and he figured out Frank was the guy who treated Jack Buck. And Frank's major aspiration was to play Major League Baseball, because you had guys from the Hill like Frank Crespi, who played for the Cardinals, Joe Garagiola, who played for the Cardinals, and of course Yogi Berra, the national, the Baseball Hall of Famer. And Frank was a catcher. He played 1 season in the Cardinals minor league system in 1946. Other teams had tried to sign him. His mother was dead set against it. Frank's dad had passed away when he was 15. So she saw Frank as the family's support instead of going out playing baseball. So she basically ran the scouts out of the house. And so he became an undertaker at Calcaterra Funeral Home on the Hill. Frank was a big guy, great hands, but the quietest person in the world, one of the most humble people I've ever met. So Frank was a big guy. He had a very imposing presence, sort of the gentle giant guy.
Good goalkeeper.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yes.
Harry Kehoe was considered one of the best American players of his generation. We met his son. Talk to me a little bit about Harry and what he offered.
Harry came from a family that lived in the Spanish neighborhood, although he was Irish, east of Carondelet Park. Much like the Hill, he learned to play soccer on the playground. He said there was a place nearby called the Spanish Lot. Everybody would go there and play. He learned the game there. He had an older brother named Bill, for whom, by the way, Ty is named. Ty's first name is William. So Harry idolized his brother Bill, and Bill played in the professional league in St. Louis. So he learned the game by going to the Spanish Lot, watching these players play in the professional league. He was in the Navy right after World War II, so he didn't see action. When he came back, he played for various amateur teams, McMahon, Ford, people like that. We had a semi-professional league that started here in 1947. So Harry played for them. He said later on, I owed my place on the team to Walter Giesler, because Walter had seen me play, and I was pretty much an unknown guy. I think he was 22 in 1950. But Harry was a very smart guy. He was known for an impeccable memory. He could remember everything. So, in fact, the book on the game called The Game of Their Lives is basically based on Harry's minute-by-minute breakdown of the game.
Wow, yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
Gino Pariani and Frank Pee Wee Wallace were neighbors across the street, as I understand. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell me about those two.
Well, Frank Pee Wee Wallace is another one of the war veterans. He was captured by the Germans, in fact, in Anzio in Italy. He was a tanker, served in the 191st Tank Battalion. So he spent 16 months in a German POW camp. Didn't want to talk much about it. But other than that, he was sort of like the life of the team. He could say things just off the cuff, like maybe 2 sentences, and everybody just fall on the floor laughing. So everybody really loved Pee Wee. He was extremely fast, probably the fastest guy in the 1950 team. He played with Gino on, in those days they played outside left, outside right, inside right. Pee Wee was the outside right, Gino was the inside right. So they were a very tight team and played together through all the years with Simpkins Ford, 2 U.S. Open Cup champions. So we've got the 2 offensive fire plugs out of that 5 group.
And then the final one, Charlie Colombo.
Charlie Colombo.
Incredible name. He made the game-saving tackle that they talk about.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about him.
He's an interesting story. Depending on who you talk to, he was either a very competitive guy or a very let's test the rules kind of guy. But they said he would intimidate anybody, including, he didn't care if it was England, he didn't care if it was another guy from St. Louis. If he marked you, he was there to mark you out of the game, and he did it any way he could. In fact, I asked Harry about that once, and he said, well, I was a center back, but I couldn't play center back like Charlie. And he kind of paused, and he said, well, Charlie was brutal. So Charlie was, his motto was win at any cost. He was a interesting guy because off the field, everybody said he was the nicest guy you ever met. He would go out of your way to help you. Extremely nice, but when on a soccer field, he was like 180 degrees. I mean, he would yell at you, curse at you, poke you in the ribs, kick you in the back. Guys who play with him said people don't understand that after the game, he was pretty beat up too. So he took a beating as a center back, and he took his job very seriously.
That's amazing. All right, let's talk about chemistry and connections. You mentioned that that there maybe wasn't enough chemistry in previous teams, and that US Soccer had decided that they wanted to change that. Was part of the selection choice for the World Cup team bringing people together that lived in the same area because there was an inherent chemistry? Is my assumption that those guys knew each other and had played with each other in the past, is that an incorrect assumption? Like, how did they build the connections to be able to carry out this defeat?
You know, in those days, we didn't have the media, we didn't have the TV, the coverage of the game, so they never saw each other play. They played against each other. That's how they knew each other. Simpkins Ford played the New York Brookhattons in the 1948 U.S. Open Cup final. The center forward for the Brookhattons was Joe Gagins, who scored a goal in the game. So they had encountered each other over the years as competitors. Walter Giesler's idea was to hold a tryout in St. Louis. He brought players from the east and west part of the United States. They played a game, everybody watched them, and a lot of the player selection decisions were made based on what they saw in St. Louis from that game.
Where did they play that game?
I believe it was a public school stadium, which at that time was in North St. Louis, very close to where Matthews Dickey Boys Club is. Obviously it's no longer there, but it was a major sporting event facility for soccer, track and field. Bob Hayes, who set the world record in the 100-yard dash there in the 1960s. So it was, I believe it was held there. I'm not sure about that, but I think that's the case.
So by modern standards, they weren't really prepared for the World Cup at all.
Not to the extent they would be today, no. The way they set up the team was smart. They tried to set it up in combinations. So the outside right and outside left were Gino Pariotti and Pee Wee Wallace from St. Louis from the same team. The outside left and outside right were from Fall River, Massachusetts. They had played together. Those were the Souzas. Same last name, but not related. Walter Barr and Ed McElveny played for the same team in Philadelphia. They were the halfbacks. So they had pairings set up. They were smart, and they tried to pair people who would play together, thinking that would build cohesion on the team.
That is very interesting. So they get picked for the squad, and the part of the story that we're trying to tell as St. Louis City for this special occasion is they went to Brazil. Nobody talks about Brazil, and I know that St. Louis today, as you came into the office, is extremely hot and extremely muggy, but Brazil presents extremely challenging conditions for any team. And, the recent World Cup there, Germany went out of their way to create systems to make sure that their players were hydrated, that they could deal with the altitude. These guys in the 1950s what sort of preparation would they have made for Brazil? And like even a basic, how did they get there? Because private jet wasn't really an option in the same way that it is these days, and flying was probably quite dangerous. Did they go by boat? Like what was the story there?
They flew from New York. Immediately they played the English FA-11. There was a banquet after the game with the two teams. They got on a plane like at midnight and flew to Brazil. The story is it was about a 30-hour ordeal with all the stops they had to make, the delays in the airport and things like that. It's just something that you had to deal with at that time, but it wasn't easy. And once you got there, as you mentioned, the conditions were not what you would expect from where you came from. The English were particularly taken aback by the altitude issue. They had oxygen for the English players at halftime of their first game. But from what I've read, the guy said the oxygen didn't help. It just sucked the life out of you. And it took a tremendous amount of time to adjust to that. The other issue was with food. The food in the hotel, the English hotel in particular, when they first got there, it was totally unacceptable to what they were used to. And Walter Winterbottom, the manager, had to go show the cooks how to cook the food for the players on the team. So it was a cultural adjustment. Interestingly, Belo Horizonte was a mining town, which had an English contingent of engineers there. So the English team stayed in the English conclave and practiced. They sat on a field, which was much nicer than the actual stadium.
So was that a high altitude place? Was Belo Horizonte, was it a high altitude place or not so much because they were mining?
Not so much. Right. And both teams got there a few days early, so they were somewhat acclimated to it. So
were all the players comfortable with flying? I mean, I can't imagine that many of them were like jetting around.
I haven't read any stories about that. I mean, I haven't read anybody who said they were scared of it. So there's no documentation about that.
Getting on a plane in the 50s,
right.
Dangerous times.
Yeah.
Bill Jeffrey was appointed the coach 2 weeks before the tournament when Erno Schwartz declined the position. Scottish man, taking down the English. Yeah. Who'd have thought it? How did he get the job, and what was he doing in America?
Well, he coached at Penn State. He coached there for a number of years before the 1950 World Cup. And he was successful there, although it wasn't a sanctioned sport at that time, so it wasn't an NCAA sport. It was, it was an organized sport, but there was no sanctioned competition.
Yeah.
But he was successful with what he did, and they figured, well, this guy is as good as anybody. So they brought him in, and the players said he didn't have enough time to coach us, and he was smart enough not to try. He basically said, do your best.
I like that strategy. Yeah. What were the character traits that he had? Was he a big personality? Was he bang the table kind of coach?
From what I've read, he was a very quiet guy. He didn't say a whole lot. I mean, his pregame speech was, do the best you can. We're probably not going to win, but just do your best and we'll see what happens.
Very motivating.
Let's throw out a ball and see what happens is basically what he said.
Did they have what was scouting like back then? Could you even do it? Did America have enough funds to be able to send people to look at the teams they were playing? Were England watched widely on the TV at that sort of?
I think the general feeling was among everybody in soccer, England's a team to beat. They're the founders of the sport. They had some success in some of their games before the World Cup. Their places of favor was more on reputation than anything else, because as you mentioned, in those days there were no television coverage of games. There wasn't the technology we had to track players and other teams. Interestingly enough, the Brazil people did scout the English in their pre-World Cup games and took film back with them to Brazil, and the players studied the film. England did not do that, and Americans had no clue. I mean, they didn't bother worrying about that.
Probably couldn't really scout the American players because they played so few games together.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Although the English FA-11 played them the day before they left for Brazil, and Stanley Matthews was with that contingent, so he could bring back some insights to the Americans, to the English team. I don't know what he told them, but he was there to watch them play.
In World Cups, there are beloved nations and there are nations that are not so beloved. America and England, coming out of a world war, probably had different reputations. Who did the Brazilians plump for? Because there were 10,000 people in the stadium for the game.
When the game started, yes.
Yeah, when the game started,
yes,
it
they
grew.
said that the crowd grew as word of mouth spread. People heard on the radio that they're winning. And the claim is that by the end of the game, there were 30,000 people there, which was the capacity of the stadium. People were climbing over fences to get in because they heard what was going on. They wanted to come see it. And Brazil, as the host team, they viewed England as their number one threat. So anybody who could beat England, they were all for.
So the main point of communication for this game, obviously there's no Twitter, there's no Apple TV. Was it on TV at all, or was this just like a pure radio game?
The interesting thing about this game is it's so difficult to be objective about it because we have virtually no visual record. There's maybe 2 minutes of video, and it's all little snippets spliced together, so there's no flow. You can't see how the game was progressing. You're basing what you're talking about on newspaper reports and on memory. So it's very difficult to be objective about it because some of the reports after a game, they conflicted each other. I mean, I saw one where it said that later in the game when Frank Borghi made a save that saved the game, one of the accounts said a defender raced in and pulled the ball out of the net. That's like, where did they get that at? The goalkeeper got a hand on it. It may have crossed the line. Nobody's sure, but there was not a defender who went into the goal and pulled the ball out. So you had things like that, and you're trying to figure out, well, what actually happened? I think the only two things everybody agrees on is that the English were a far better team, and second, the U.S. won. Those are the only two things we can say for sure.
So the English had some pretty incredible players. For any of the English historian buffs out there, Stanley Matthews, legend Tom Finney, Sir Alf Ramsey, who was the manager for England when they won the World Cup in 1966. This really was a stacked lineup, and I sort of started to try and dig into the game. A lot of woodwork was hit. This was it was a giant killing, but it was by the skin of the teeth sort of giant killing, right? If there was XG back in the day, it would have been a pretty horrendous XG.
Yes, I mean, after the game, the English guys were like, how could we not score? We did everything but put the ball in the net. It's interesting how that the English approached their first two games. They didn't play Stanley Matthews.
Rested him.
They rested him, yeah, which gives you an idea of what they thought of the first two games they were going to play. And he was sitting in the stands watching the USA game, and who knows what his thoughts were after that. But your best player is not in the game. It's interesting in the World Cup that you rest your best player.
And what part of the tournament was this game? Was this like did they do group stages? Was this the knockout round?
This was the group stage. This was the second game for both teams. The U.S. played very well in their first game against Spain. They were winning with 12 minutes to play and gave up 3 goals in the last 12 minutes because accounts are that the guys say we just ran out of gas.
Yeah.
There was a lot of partying going on in this trip too. So
the players were partying.
Oh yes, absolutely.
The good old days.
Yes. So they played very well against Spain. Kind of a omen, I guess, for the next game. English won their first game against Chile, so set up the game number 2 in Belo Horizonte.
The USA team must have felt pretty devastated that in their group they get England, one of the best teams, and Spain, 2 extremely strong sides throughout history.
I get the feeling from what I've read and when I've talked to Harry and Frank, that was no big deal. I mean, we're going to have to play these teams anyway. I mean, so we play them in the first round. If we get out of the first round and meet them in the second round, I never heard anybody say that they regretted having to play England in the second game. The people I've talked to about that game, I think it was just that's fate. We'll deal with it.
And the odds, what were the odds? Did they have odds?
The odds are that the U.S. was a 500-1 against winning the World Cup, and England was the 3-1 favorite to win the whole World Cup. So you're talking about long odds.
500-1. I mean, that's crazy. You wouldn't get those odds in any World Cup game in the modern era, right?
The last World Cup when Saudi Arabia beat Argentina, I've read the odds were 1,200-1.
Oh, okay. All right. Stand corrected. So, some bookies out of pocket there. So there was a journalist there with the most incredible name, Dent McSkimming. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a sort of character that would pop up in an old Superman comic. Yeah. How did he end up being the only chronicler of this event?
Dent was the soccer writer not just in St. Louis, but perhaps in all the United States.
Was he from St. Louis?
He was from St. Louis. He played as a kid. He started covering soccer in the 1910s. He would go to a game and sit in the bleachers in a space all by himself because he didn't want people to bother him. The players very, very much respected him because he was very honest. He would say when you played well and when you didn't. One of the stories was a guy who came back after the Korean War and in one of his early games, a guy named Val Pellizzaro, and Dent wrote about the game. He said, Val is not on speaking terms with the ball.
That's a pretty, some of those lines from,
he was very blunt. He loved soccer. He wanted to go to the World Cup. The Post-Dispatch, his employer, wouldn't pay his way, so he took vacation, paid his own way down there. That's how we got there.
Was it expensive?
He flew with the team. I'm sure it was. I don't know. I can't quote you on the price, but I'm sure it was not an inexpensive deal. Although he went with the team, maybe the team picked it up. I don't know.
And talk to me about the goal. You mentioned it briefly early. This is the one thing that everybody agreed on. What sort of goal was scored and who scored it?
Joe Gachins.
Joe Gachins
from Haiti. Was in New York at the time. He was a student at Columbia University. The story is he was a dishwasher, but he was actually a college student who did dishwashing for the person who owned the team he played for. The guy basically gave him a job to help him make ends meet while he was going to school.
Yeah.
This guy was a tremendous player. Every team he played for in Haiti and later in the United States, he was always a 15 to 20 goal scorer every season. Mm-hmm. Before the World Cup, Walter Barr was talking to Harry Keogh about Joe Gates, and he said, this guy is crazy, but he scores the most uncanny goals you've ever seen in your life. He would throw his body at things. He was able to do things with his body that nobody had seen soccer guys do in their previous experiences. So the goal, England's dominating the game. They've hit the woodwork numerous times. The U.S. has had a couple chances. They have a throw-in just inside the attacking half on their right side. Ed McElvenney takes the throw-in to Walter Barr. Walter's about 10 yards into the attacking half. He dribbles about 20 yards. He's about 25 yards out from the goal. He says, what the heck, let's take a shot at it. So he sends a hard, low shot right across the penalty spot. The goalkeeper is moving to his right to make the save. Joe Gachins, Harry Keogh later said the guy looked like he took off and flew. He just threw him spotty towards where the ball was going. And Harry said the ball was like this, hit his head. And it was going this way, changed directions, went that way. The goalkeeper, Bert Williams, was already here, so he had no chance to reach it. So it just grazed off his head into the net. So very unlikely goal, but as Walter Barr said, this guy scores the most uncanny goals you've ever seen.
So also a good lesson to the young soccer players listening, always take a chance, always follow in. You never know what's going to happen.
Absolutely, follow the shot.
So Team USA, they managed to hold on. Talk to me about the goalkeeping performance, because it sounds like Frank had a big job on his hands.
He absolutely did. Now, Frank was a big guy. I mean, he was 5'11", but he looked like he was 6'4". He was built that way. He had huge hands. He was a catcher. They said he could throw the ball to midfield. He was very good in the air. So on any cross, if you the little footage that exists, there are several shots of him going up and taking down crosses. The English guys, here's the English guy at his shoulder, and Frank's so tall, he's way up here. So he was very good on taking the aerial balls down on the chances that the English put on goal. He was always there. It was the goalkeeping performance of his life.
Was he man of the match?
Yes, he definitely was. Later in the game, after the incident with Charlie Colombo, we can talk about that. But Harry made a save on Frank made a save on that, and Harry, who was the right back, said it was the greatest save I've ever seen in my life.
Wow!
So he was the man who rose to the occasion.
What was the Charlie Colombo incident?
With 8 minutes left in the game, England's trying to even the score. Stanley Mortensen has a breakaway. Charlie is maybe, 5-10 feet behind him. Charlie was a big guy, but very fast. And the story is, right before he got to the penalty area, he just launched himself at this guy and just basically tackled him, which was probably a red card, right? The referee was from Italy. Charlie's from Italy, and he talks to Charlie after the game, and they said that the people who were there said he was yelling at Charlie, and Charlie said, no, he wasn't. He said, good play, good play. So he didn't award, he just called a foul.
Yeah.
There was a free kick. Jimmy Mullen got on a header on the end of the free kick and sent it into the goal. Low shot. Frank reached behind him as the ball was on the line and swatted it out. There's a lot of controversy on whether the whole ball crossed the line or not. Harry Keogh said, I don't think it did, but I can't be sure. And no VAR, right?
And in the end,
referee said,
who cares?
No goal.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
so the game finishes.
Well, the interesting thing about that game is 4 minutes left. Pee Wee Wallace had a breakaway, faked out the goalkeeper, had an empty net, shot it, and one of the defenders came back and saved it on the line. And after the game, he said, if I had just hit it a little harder, it would have gone in. Because can you imagine 2-0?
Yeah. Oh, that would be that would calm the nerves.
Yeah, but given the bad luck the English had, I think the Americans certainly should have had some bad luck.
So the game finishes. The Team USA wins. What's the reaction from the players? What do they do to celebrate that one?
Frank Borghi said, I was in the goal farthest away from the locker room. And he said, all these people were running on the field towards me. And he said, I was scared to death. I didn't know what they were going to do. But they picked him up on his shoulders and carried him all the way to the locker room. So the players, it's interesting. Harry Keogh told Dent McSkimming after the game. Dent did a wrap-up piece later. He said, we actually felt sorry for England. We're
very un-American.
Right. I mean, because he knew that
not normally like that.
He admitted they were a better team. He said, we really actually felt bad because we beat them because they deserved to move on in the tournament. So, I mean, they were very realistic about it,
What was the next phase of the tournament for the U.S. men's national team?
They played Chile in the next game. Pee Wee Wallace scored a goal at 2-2 with nearing the 60-minute mark, and then they gave up 3 goals in the last half hour and lost 5-2 and went home. So
again, probably a fitness struggle with the heat, the humidity.
Yeah,
sounds like they're losing that many goals.
Talking to Gino Periotti's son, Glenn Periani, he said, my dad said a lot of these guys are just there to party. So
kind of like
Gino said, we just would have sent the whole Simpkins team, we wouldn't have won the whole tournament.
Love it. So what was the reaction around the world to the defeat?
Shock. And the interesting thing is England, the same day on June 29th, England's cricket team lost to the West Indies for the very first time. So there was a very somber mood in England in the next day's newspapers. We lost in cricket. We lost to this team nobody heard of. No hopers, they were called. Amateurs. They made a big thing out of the dishwasher scored the goal. These guys don't even play full time. How could this happen? It's like, this is the end of the world.
I've been in England during those moments many times. I can imagine what it was like. So what about in America? America loves a winning story, loves a giant killing. Was it open top bus parade when they got back?
No. The Korean War just started, so all the newspaper coverage was focused on what was going on in Korea. Soccer, outside of a very few parts of the United States, was just another sport. Nobody really, it was nice filler material, paragraph here to fill up a hole in the newspaper. There was, and there was also the issue of, did this really happen? The stories in the New York Times refused to print a story. They said it must be a mistake. They must have lost 10-0. They didn't win 1-0. So they didn't even run a story until they had verified it. So that's how shocked some people were, but there wasn't a lot of coverage of it for other factors, such as the Korean War and soccer not being, on the front burner of American mindset.
So when did the story start getting into the culture in America?
It got into St. Louis right away because Dent McSkimming was there. He filed a story in the next day's Post-Dispatch. Interesting story about the media coverage. They had 2 phone lines at the stadium in Belo Horizonte for all the reporters. So you can imagine how big the English contingent was.
Yeah.
So they said guys were trying to fight for use this one phone, and they had to dictate their story back to Rio de Janeiro. And it was then sent by cable to wherever your newspaper was located. So it was a very difficult time technology-wise. to communicate about the game. Although it did show up here, I relied very much on what Dent McSkimming wrote because he was there and very honest. Some of the other newspaper accounts were somewhat colored one way or the other.
And how did this game affect the players' lives in St. Louis? Were they big celebrities locally? What did they?
In the soccer community, people were shocked. But outside of the soccer community, the story is when Harry Keogh got here off the plane, he got on a bus and went to Peoria to play in a softball tournament.
Really?
Yes. So, the guys' lives really didn't change at all. They just went back to their daytime jobs, playing soccer on the weekends in the semi-professional league. Harry said they got $6 if they won, $4 if they tied, and $2 if they lost. So that was their lives in the immediate aftermath. Really no recognition outside of the immediate soccer community.
So the expectation would be after a big win like that, the US soccer would move forward, but the country didn't qualify for a World Cup for 40 years after. Why didn't a story like that spark a movement for investment or something like that?
There's this mindset that soccer is not an American sport. We're rugged individualists. We invented baseball. We took soccer and made it better and made it gridiron football. There was that mindset. Plus, at the time, you only have 3 television networks, so you don't have people dying to get something to fill up airtime because we have so many channels today. We have so much sports coverage. Those days, that didn't happen. The New York Yankees dominated the 1950s. The end of the 1950s, the NFL came to the forefront. So we had pro football taking over from baseball. Soccer was just not on people's minds. It was interesting, though, what really turned things around was the 1966 World Cup, because there was a big viewership here of that final, which was shown on a somewhat of a delay. That led to the formation of the North American Soccer League in the aftermath of the 1966 World Cup. So here we have television inspiring soccer to finally become a nationwide sport in the United States, something that didn't happen in the 1950s.
And what happened with the players? Did they pick up jobs? Did they try and double down on their legacy and create things for St. Louis off the back of it? Like, how did they take advantage of local fame?
They just went about their way. Harry Keogh played for the team he played for. Eventually became Cootis, which may have been the best soccer team in the United States in the 1950s. They won 6 U.S. Amateur Cups in a row, and the U.S. Open Cup in one of those years, being the last team in history to win both in the same year. So he played there. Everyone knows what happened after that. He became the coach at St. Louis University, their second coach, following Bob Gelker. Bob won 5 national championships. Harry took over and won 5. So he made his path in life as a coach, part-time coach. He was always working at the U.S. Postal Service all these years. So none of these guys made any money out of soccer. Frank Borghi and all the other guys who played for Simpkins Ford kept playing for Simpkins Ford. They made the U.S. Amateur Cup finals twice and didn't win in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, it was Cootis and Simpkins Ford. Ironically, the same guys from the 1950 team, on the 2 best teams in St. Louis. An interesting postscript to this whole story, Charlie Colombo, after his playing days were over, he coached what became the St. Ambrose team. It was not a church team, it was a very high-level team. In 1964, Liverpool played here. They had just won the English First Division. He was the coach of the team they played. It was called the St. Louis CYC All-Stars. So with 8 minutes left, guess what happens? The CYC All-Stars are winning 1-0 over Liverpool, the kings of English football. The English had to score with 4 minutes left to get a tie. So if they had won that game, people would be talking about that as much as they'd be talking about the 1950 game in
Liverpool
St. Louis.
Side, like very
Absolutely.
dominant, right, on every level.
Yes. So that was an interesting postscript. The guy that played on a team that beat England is managing a team that almost beat Liverpool in 1964.
So to kind of like conclude on this story, why should the people of St. Louis continue to care about stories like this, and why is it important for you personally as a historian to see the flame being carried by another generation of people in St. Louis? Well,
obviously the fact that these 5 guys were born and raised here is a big thing. these are 5 guys who are just the salt of the earth type of guys. We're going to do our jobs. We're going to do the best we can. We're going to try our best, and we'll see what happens. I mean, it's like the American dream of people succeeding because they tried to do their best. So I think that's the story in it. For whatever field of life you're into, if you give it your all, anything can happen.
And you've studied American soccer history for a very long time. Could you tell me what your hopes are for US soccer more broadly over the next decade, knowing that one of the most important generational moments ever in US soccer history is happening with the World Cup arriving in America next year?
That's a great question. The men's team is struggling right now. They've been struggling. They've had good years and bad years. I'd like to see some consistency in terms of who they pick and who plays. I'm a little partial, being we have Tim Ream, we have Patrick Schulte, the goalkeeper. We have Josh Sargent, the forward, who's scoring goals like crazy in England. I'd like to see these guys come back here and play professionally. It's a shame that so many of these guys go overseas to play now instead of playing here. So I guess my dream is to see the best players playing here all the time.
That's great. Well, Dave, thank you for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts about the history of this incredible victory. And I always have a little tradition on the show. Last message goes to the fans. If you got anything that you wanted to say to the St. Louis fans, or direct them to anything that you think would be interesting.
Keep coming to the games. Keep supporting a team like you are. I think there are great things ahead for City. I'm a season ticket holder. I never miss a game. So I hope everybody else continues to be fanatic fans of City.
Fantastic. Well, that takes us to the end of our Hill to Brazil special. Dave Lange, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was very educational and very insightful. And if you're listening to this on your podcast app, make sure you give us a little 5-star review. And we will be back with more podcast episodes in the future. And hopefully we can have you back on the show for another edition very soon.
I'd love to be here. Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ciao for now.